Welcome to the Human Experience Podcast, the only podcast designed to fuse your left and right brain hemispheres and feed it the most entertaining and mentally engaging topics on the planet. As we approach our ascent, please make sure your frontal, temporal and occipital lobes are in their full upright position. As you take your seat of consciousness, relax your senses and allow us to take you on a journey. We are the Intimate Strangers. Thank you for listening.
Welcome to yet another episode of the Human Experience Live Show. We've got an incredible show planned for you guys today, so sit back, grab a drink, and enjoy this conversation. My guest for today is Mr. Steven Kotler. Steven is an award-winning journalist and best-selling author who studies the potential of humans, technology, and culture as we advance into the future. An expert in flow states, Steven is co-founder and director of research at the Flow Genome Project. He is the author of a number of best-selling books, such as the Pulitzer Prize-nominated Stealing Fire. Steven's work has been translated into over 40 languages and he has appeared in over 100 publications. Steven, it's a pleasure to have you join us once again. Welcome back to HXP.
Thank you for having me, man. Appreciate it.
It's been a couple years, and it seems like all you do, you just churn out books. That's what you do. That's your job.
Yeah, I'm writing to save my life, so why stop?
Yeah, I mean, it's really amazing the different topics that you cover. So, I mean, let's talk about it. How do you come up with what you're going to write about?
It's an interesting question because what I'm going to write about often, it finds me years in advance. I tend to see my books 5 to 10 years out and then slowly gather in bits of information until I think I've got something coherent. And sometimes, for example, Stealing Fire started out originally as a book about economics, believe it or not, of all things. And so like they don't start out, they don't often end up where they start out. But I don't know, I've always been curious, but I haven't really encountered much that I'm not curious about. So as long as there's still things for me to learn, there's still things for me to write about.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the last time we talked to you, we were covering the rise of Superman, which was an amazing exploration into the flow states and consciousness and how we can capture that for on the everyday sort of consumer level version of that. And now, you're diving into this whole other realm of cyberspace, the cyberpunk phenomena, and it seems like you sort of based your inspiration for this book was William Gibson, right? How did that become an inspiration for you?
There's a lot. It came from a lot of different places, but Gibson was really powerful to me. Specifically, I remember so clearly. I had just gotten out of college. I was living in Aspen, Colorado. I was ski bumming and bartending, basically. And working on my first novel, and I read Neuromancer, and I remember reading that book and thinking, "Holy crap! This guy is talking about really big ideas, really hard." I mean, this is 1986, 87. He's talking about questions about AIs waking up and things like, cyberspace, years before the internet, and it was just so visionary. But I remember how much fun it was and how much of a page turner it was, and that really stayed with me. I always sort of felt as a writer that if you're going to there's so much shit to pay attention to in the world today. If you're going to give me your attention, right, you're going to give me 6 or 7 or 8 hours of your life, you're going to let me live in your head for that long while you read one of my books. It is my job not just to kind of blow your mind and try to maybe teach you something, but it's also my job to really engage you and entertain you and move you through a story. And I was really drawn to big philosophical, hard ideas, as you know, but I wanted to find a way to make them entertaining and not lose their intellectual quality. And this was, by the way, you have to understand that, like, as a writer, I came out as I was hugely inspired by guys like Thomas Pynchon and David Foster Wallace, and I got to study under the great John Barth. And these, brilliant, brilliant, brilliant writers, but they really pushed the edge of communication, right? They were willing to sacrifice communication for art. And they were willing to say, okay, not everybody has to get it, but the people who are going to get it, it's really going to be deep. And I thought that was great. But I was always sort of a little bit interested in, can you make this a little more accessible? Can you not sacrifice the art, but can you make and can you not sacrifice the intelligence and the level of conversation, in the book, be it fiction or nonfiction, but still make it wildly entertaining? And that's sort of always been my goal in my books.
Yeah.
So that's really, it's something I learned from Gibson, is that you could do both at the same time.
Yeah. Just really quick, Stephen, I'm getting word that there's a little bit of air hitting your microphone. So if you could maybe just back up a little bit on the mic, that might help.
Oh yeah. How's that? Is that better?
That's much better. Thank you. So, okay. So, how many books have you written so far? I think it's been like 10. This is your 10th book, right?
10 or 11.
Okay.
I think 11, because I have a book that's done that's coming out in the fall.
Okay.
And then I actually, as a matter of fact, Peter Diamandis and myself have a new book. It's a sequel to Bold and the third in the trilogy, after Bold and Abundance, coming out in February. And I literally finished that today at like 4 a.m. or 5 a.m. Yeah. So it's 12 that are, I think, done, but I think it's 10 that are out, I think.
So I've listened to a bunch of interviews, and I remember our last interview, but as I was researching for this show, and I want to make this show a little bit different. So I want to get into your writing process, namely, like because I really want to know, what harnesses that creativity for you. Like, how do you decide to sit down, and what goes through your mind? Is there a ritual that you practice?
Yeah, I've talked about this a little bit. I always sort of do the same thing. I try to get from my bed to my desk in under 5 minutes. And I always start, and I could talk about why, but let me give you the rituals.
Okay.
I start writing at 4 a.m. every day, and I write from 4 a.m. till 8 a.m. basically. Today I was excited to finish the book, so I got up a little earlier. It just happened. But I write from 4 a.m. to 8 a.m. and I try to bed to desk as fast as possible. I write in absolute darkness. There's no lights in my office. It's pitch black in here. Everything's turned off, so absolute silence and quiet. Sometimes I'll listen to music, usually the same song over and over and over and over again for whatever reason. But if the song sort of matches the vibe or the emotion of what I'm trying to write, I'll just put it on repeat and listen to it 1,000 times for 4 hours. That'll happen. But that's my writing ritual, and I always edit what I wrote the previous day as a way into what I'm writing today. Both because I think one of the advantages I'm willing. I'm always one of my advantages has always been hard work, and I realized very early on in my career that writers don't like to edit a whole lot, and a lot of the journalists I knew were only kind of proofreading their articles or their books 1 or 2 or 3 times. So I was like, well, hell, if I'm going to compete with them, I'm going to proofread it 5, 10, 20 times. I'm just going to keep going until I think it's perfect every time. And I thought that was an advantage. So it also works because proofreading has a lot of pattern recognition in it. And when we link ideas together, when you go, oh, this word isn't quite right, but this word will really fit in the sentence and there's rhythm there, well, that stuff starts to release dopamine. Dopamine shows up whenever the brain connects ideas together, right? And dopamine is a focusing drug. And if you get enough of it into your system, you can start to drive yourself into flow. So I always like to edit first before I sort of face the blank page of what I got to add on, because it's pushing me much closer to flow before I actually get to the, oh my God, what am I going to write today? And then I'm very, I write in a layered process.
Okay.
It's the first time through, and I've learned this over the years. I used to always start with style, what tone, what rhythm, how do I want the language to work? And I discovered that was a disaster for me because it would lock me into a style before I actually knew what the hell I was talking about. And sometimes the style didn't fit the substance, and then you had all kinds of problems. So these days, the first thing that goes in is like the who, what, where, when, and why, and how, and almost as fast as I can get it out. Trying not to linger over the sentences and trying not to edit as much. My tendency is to always edit everything and be a perfectionist and perfect a sentence before I go on to the next one. And I try to move past that and not do that. And the second layer is the information layer. It's where I really put in, if I'm writing fiction, it's where the ideas or the dialogue will start to get into the plot. If I'm writing nonfiction, it's usually the big ideas that are going to go into a section, and then the last thing that happens is the style goes on at the end, and I write that way. And I find I can write 2 or 3 times as fast.
It's really amazing because you seem to switch into different. You talked about almost everything that I can think of that I'm interested in. I mean, you've talked about flow, you've talked about psychedelics, you've talked about stealing fire. I mean, so and there's so much that is interesting to you, and so I found in this book you shifted from nonfiction to this fiction aspect, and it seems like it was it a little freeing for you? Did you feel more free writing in this style?
Well, I'm trained as a novelist. And my first book is a novel. And actually my second book is a novel, though it's hidden in a drawer, and I don't think anybody is ever going to see it. But so I have a fiction background. So it was a return to that. And it was very, very, very freeing. And especially because I had come out of it. I wrote, we talked when I wrote Rise of Superman. After that, I wrote Bold, which was a collaborative book. I wrote Peter Diamandis. And then I wrote Tomorrowland. Or right after Rise, I wrote Tomorrowland. And then I wrote Bold, which was collaborative with Peter. And after Bold, I wrote Stealing Fire with Jamie, and that was another collaboration. And I really, I was sort of tired of the collaborations. I really wanted to do my own thing for a little while. And this was incredibly freeing. It was the most fun I've ever had writing a book. I've never laughed so hard myself. And I work with, I have an editor I work with, though. This last Tango also had a fantastic, I don't want to give him short shift, a fantastic editor at St. Martin's that I got to work with as well, Pete Wolverton. But I work with a guy, Michael Wharton, who's edited all my stuff for about 25 years. He's my closest friend. And we both talk about writing Last Tango as the most, we couldn't stop laughing. It was so much fun.
Yeah. I mean, I love the process. What do you do, Stephen, when you hit the wall? I mean, you've got to have those days where you're not feeling it, right?
Rarely. And the reason is, so I don't know if this is, so all this stuff that we're talking about, I do a class through by the way, I left the Flow Genome Project 6 months ago. I'm the executive director of the Flow Research Collective. I basically took all the science work that we were doing and I spun it out into a separate organization called the Flow Research Collective. No worries whatsoever. But through them, I do something called Flow for Writers, and I do it twice a year. I think the next one is in LA in July. July the 12th, 13th, and 14th. And it's essentially a 2-day boot camp on all this stuff where we really sort of go into it. But this is one of the things I teach is how not to ever get writer's block, essentially. And so usually writer's block has 3 main causes. There are other reasons, and there can be other stuff. And fear is a real issue for writers. Fear can absolutely cause writer's block, and there's a lot of neurobiological reasons for that, and I can break it down if you care. But writing is an ongoing negotiation with fear, so you have to have really solid practices in place to kind of lower fear and keep it down, because it really blocks the brain from thinking creatively. So that's first and foremost.
Sure.
But most of the time, writer's block is one of 3 things for me. And I actually have watchwords. So For me, writer's block usually is you don't know your starts and your endings. You don't know where your chapter starts or where your chapter is going. You don't know where your section starts or where your section is ending. And if you don't know where your starts and your endings are, you're really screwed. Gabriel Garcia Marquez used to say, I spend years in my first paragraph and my last paragraph and months on everything in between. And he was totally right about that one, as far as I can tell. So that first and foremost. And the second thing is, usually if you're confused, you don't know your starts to your endings, or you haven't actually done enough research, so you don't know how to connect everything through, right? Those are the two most critical causes of writer's block. The third cause is you haven't found the style you want to write in yet. That tends to be the third. So I literally, and for me, I have learned over the years that my writing has tells, and most people's writing has tells. So, for example, if my writing is confusing, if I'm working with my editor or reading my stuff and it's just, I'm lost, he's lost, whatever, we're confused because I don't know my starts and my endings. That's always the cause. If my writing is arrogant, I'm using a lot of fancy language and a lot of really kind of fancy sentences, I'm usually and often subconsciously trying to cover up for the fact that I haven't done enough research and I don't know what the hell I'm talking about yet. And if my writing is arrogant, cocky in a sense, that's usually that sometimes can be I haven't done enough research, and sometimes it's just I haven't found the right style. And so I tend to look for those things, but the thing you have to know about the brain is the brain does a couple things really well. Okay. It does pattern recognition at a really basic level, right? We have giant pattern recognition machines for brains, and our brain also does narrative storytelling really well. Think about your own life. Your brain tells the story sequentially really easily, right? So I always tell people, if you know your starts, you know your endings, and you've done enough research, your brain will automatically do the hard work in between for you, because it does that. It will build a story out of it. We'll do pattern recognition. It will find the connections. So you can count on that. You can count on your natural biology to do its job. You just have to know how to feed the system.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, it does break down into a neurological system. That's what's going on, and but I find it interesting that you have those rare moments. I mean, I'm talking to the person who is an expert at flow, so it shouldn't surprise me as much. But I find it interesting that you don't have that feeling of I just don't feel like writing today. I just don't feel like.
Oh no, I have that feeling all the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, of course I have that feeling. I'm a human being, but so first of all, I always say this, and peak performance, if you really have been inside true peak performance, seen it up close, lived through it yourself, et cetera, most of the time, really, when you're seeing exceptional human beings, what you're seeing is people who can get up and do the checklist. I wake up in the morning, there's 10 things on my checklist. I'm going to kick ass at all of them. I'm going to get some exercise. I'm going to get some food. I'm going to have a little bit of social time because that's good for my head. I'm going to have some kind of active recovery protocol. I'm going to go to bed. I'm going to get up and I'm going to do it again. And that's usually what peak performance looks like. The difference is it's done over and over and over for years on end without cessation. And it's not, to do it, you have to not care how it feels. I always tell people, if you come to one of our flow trainings or really any of the peak performance work that we do, and whether we're working with individuals or organizations, I always tell people this work is not about happy or sad. It turns out that flow, is deeply underpins well-being and life satisfaction, but it doesn't really underpin happiness moment by moment. How do I feel right now? How do I feel right now? It doesn't sort of work that way. And I'm less interested in happy or sad. It's not to say that I don't feel my emotions deeply and they don't rock my world like everything else, but it doesn't stop me from doing my job ever. And usually I can take that energy and turn it into language. And that's what makes me an artist, right? That was what makes me a creative, is I can take whatever the world is giving me and I can turn it into art. I can turn it into creativity. I can turn it into language, and I'll just keep going.
I love that. Love that. So let's get into it, Stephen. Let's get into, virtual reality, augmented reality. Let's talk about Last Tango and cyberspace. Because, you explore so many different things in this book. You're talking about the nature of consciousness, neuroscience, psychology, pharmacology. You're talking about, there's enough drug use in the book. So what's going, what were you aiming to do in the sense of writing it? What were you trying to indicate to the people who read it?
So I think there's two big things I was really getting at, right? And the first is, I've written over the past decade 4 books on technology and disruptive technology and accelerating technology and what's coming, abundance, bold, tomorrow, then in some extent stealing fire. And the thing with all those books is, because the story's got to make sense, they're nonfiction. I'm talking about one technology at a time, one innovation at a time. But that is really not the future, right? The future is everything at once, all these innovations at the same time. And people would always come up to me and say, Stephen, what do you think what's the world going to look like in 5 years and 10 years? These kinds of questions. And I was never dumb enough to try to answer them, because I don't actually think you can answer them out loud coherently in that way. But what I could do is I could take all the stuff I was looking at and I could put it together and build a world. So I took our world, I took every technology, everything in the book, with I think 2 exceptions, is either real in the world today, just not widely distributed, or it's in a lab somewhere. Nothing is really made up. And all this stuff is going to be here over the next 5 years. So the timetable, as far as I can tell, is pretty damn accurate. In fact, 3 or 4 of the technologies when I started writing the book were fiction. And by the time the book was published, they were already in the real world, which I thought was pretty interesting. But so I wanted to create a world. I wanted people to be able to see, you have no idea the rate of technological change that's coming. Most people can't think exponentially. They don't understand how technology is growing and what it means. So I wanted to create a way so people could go live in that world. And I also, and as you'll notice, right, like there's consciousness altering technology, which could be my work from Stealing Fire and Rise of Superman, right next to a lot of regular technology. And you pointed out the drug use, and it's not really so much drug use as it is marijuana. And the reason was, marijuana is another, at this point, it's an exponential technology that is spreading wildly and kind of weaving its way into culture at a much deeper level than it is today. And it's already if you spend some time in California and Nevada, in Washington and Oregon and these states, and it's already really deep into the culture, and you're going to get more of that as well. So I wanted to put all this stuff together in a world and tell a really fun story, right? Tell a story that would really grip people, but give people a chance to get a sense for sort of where we're going. And Ray Kurzweil, head of engineering at Google, who kind of mapped all the exponential technologies and has been really deadly accurate with so many of his predictions, has pointed out that current kind of rates of exponential growth, we will experience 20,000 years of technological change over the next century. This means we're going birth of agriculture to the Industrial Revolution twice over the next 81 years. That's insane. That means over the next 100 years or next 10 years, we're going to go through like 100 years worth of change. Just think about everything that happened technologically in the 20th century, and we're going to be there by 2030. That's the rate of change we're actually talking about in the world. So people a lot of people have read the book and said, oh my God, like I see it all, but it feels like it's 30, 40 years in the future. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly the point. That's what's happening.
Right.
It's moving that quickly. So that was one of the big impetuses. And the second big impetus, which I think is the central theme of the book, which is the absolute unbelievable critical importance of empathy to the survival of the species. Right. And I'm not just talking about empathy for all human beings, which is critically important, obviously, but I'm really focused on empathy for all, empathy for plants, for animals, for ecosystems, for empathy as the kind of the first step in really confronting the environmental challenges we now face. So those were the 2 things I was really focused on.
Yeah, I mean, I really connect with the explosion of technology. I was looking at this image of these guys in the 1950s. They were loading like this 5 megabyte hard drive, and it's this massive crate. There's 4 people pushing it into the back of this semi truck. And I mean, if you look at things now, I mean, what is that, like 60, 70 years ago? So, I mean, if you look at things now, things have exploded. I mean, we have supercomputers in our pockets. So it seems very likely that, I mean, this is right around the corner. So why?
And I'll tell you something funny, actually.
Sure.
There are a couple technologies, for example, blockchain, Bitcoin blockchain. They're in the blockchain is in the book for a line, literally a sentence. And one of the main reasons was I couldn't predict it accurately. So, and there were a couple technologies like that where I underplayed their role in the world, even though I think their role is going to be so much bigger. I couldn't get enough of a beat on it to weave it into my narrative. So, as far future as it seems, I left some technologies out.
Okay. I mean, why empathy though? Why did you fix on, AI and empathy connected? Why was that important to you?
So AI we can come to in a second, but so I care. My animals. My wife and I, we run a dog sanctuary. I've cared about the environment. I was an environmental reporter for years. This is not a new passion for me, and I've tried to be as front lines about it as I possibly can be for most of my life. And so if you talk to psychologists, eco-psychologists, these are psychologists who study how we perceive the natural world, how we interact with the natural world, how we interact with the environment. And you ask them, why are we in the middle of a giant environmental crisis? What the hell is going on, right? Why are species die-off rates 1,000 times higher than normal? Why are just, climate change, which we knew about back in the 80s and the early 90s, and suddenly we've got reports from the UN and 500 top climate scientists saying, we have 12 years to fix this or we are really, really, really sunk. Why are we at this point?
Yeah.
And they will tell you that the human brain takes in billions of bits of information a second, but consciousness is only a couple thousand bits. So the vast majority of everything gets filtered out. And most of the filters are, the first filter that information hits when it comes into the brain is the amygdala. It's a danger detector. So most of the stuff that you get to perceive is stuff that could be threatening in one way or another. It's why we always notice motion and things like that. Simultaneously, it's the goal-directed stuff. It's, is there something here I can eat? Is there something here I can have sex with? Is there something here that helps me fulfill it? Right? That's most of what gets through. And what they will tell you is if you live in boxes all day and you stare at boxes all day, which is essentially what we do here in the modern world, your brain is going to filter out everything that is unimportant. And the first thing to go is the natural world. You're going to literally stop perceiving plants, animals, and ecosystems. And they will tell you that one of the reasons we are in the middle of a giant environmental crisis is because we literally can't perceive the very thing we're trying to save. Empathy is our secret weapon. Empathy is literally how we expand perception. When we empathize with another human being, when we empathize with an ecosystem, with the earth, with the plants, with animals, the brain starts taking in different information and more information. And it changes perspective. Literally, it's how we shift the brain. It's how we do this at a really basic neurobiological level. So at the Flow Research Collective, one of our driving mottos is this idea that most of high performance is about getting your biology to work for you and not against you. That's a lot of really what you're trying to do in high performance. I always say there are no shortcuts, but the fastest way from A to B is to get your biology to work for you, especially in neurobiology. And so when I go at problems, I like to start at the very root of a problem. And the very root of our environmental problems are our brains and our consciousness and how we perceive the world. And if you can start changing that, you can change the world is essentially. So that's why I went at empathy so hard. And I also think as human beings, if we cannot get to empathy for all human beings, regardless of race, creed, color, take your pick, we're frickin' sunk. We live in a globally interconnected world that is getting more global and more interconnected by the second. And we are facing, biosphere-wide challenges that require the entire world work together. So if we can't get past this, amateur crap, we don't have a chance.
Yeah. I connect with everything you're saying, and it's really curious what you said. I'm wondering, do you think the connection, the elimination of nature is the first thing that we eliminate when we judge this sort of scale of importance, right? When we're in these boxes, do you think that the importance of the inner exploration that we're doing versus the outer exploration, is that level somehow changing or shifting?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a very good question, and that's another thing that's clearly at the center of the book. And Peter Diamandis and myself are writing a third book. I read the third in the trilogy, Bold Abundance, and this new one which will be out in February. It's called The Future is Faster Than You Think. And the very book ends with the five great, most of the book is about what's going to happen industry by industry over the next decade in technological change. But at the end of the book, we say, okay, we're going to look forward over the next 100 years for the only time in the book. And we talk about five great migrations that are going to unfold over the next 100 years that are going to absolutely reshape the globe, bigger migrations than we've ever seen before. And the last of those is the migration into consciousness. And, I think and we're seeing a lot of it, right? And consciousness itself is becoming a much wider territory than it ever has been before. And I'm not a huge fan of psychedelic culture. I'm not even that big of a fan of psychedelics, but I'll talk about them here because it's useful.
Okay.
And they're in Last Tango and Cyberspace as well. And one of the reasons there's a new psychedelic in Last Tango and Cyberspace, think about how much culture has been changed by alcohol, marijuana, peyote, LSD, psilocybin, and MDMA.
Ayahuasca.
Those add in ayahuasca, those 7 substances, right?
Yep.
Think about how much culture, how many tens, thousands and thousands of years of culture has been shaped, and maybe tobacco, caffeine, coffee, right? Like there's a dozen substances that shaped so much of culture. I mean, and we don't even have to talk about the psychedelics, right? Stephen Johnson wrote that fantastic essay, or maybe it was Malcolm Gladwell, about how coffee fueled the Enlightenment, right? Right? Because everybody was drunk all the time because they were drinking beer, and suddenly coffee was introduced. And they're like, oh my God, I got a brain. I can use it, right? I'm no longer drunk by 9 a.m. Fantastic, right? So it's on and on and on. Substances have absolutely shaped culture. Michael Pollan was really has been great on this in terms of, ideas of coevolution and things along those lines. But we went with Alexander Shulgin, right, who I wrote about in Stealing Fire. The man invented 200 different psychedelics.
Yep.
Right? We went from like 12 psychedelics to almost 300 psychedelics in one lifetime. What's coming now is, so first of all, low-hanging fruit, really easy problems for both quantum computers, which are already here, and they're getting really robust. They're starting to get robust, and artificial intelligence. And we're really at the front end of those revolutions. Low-hanging fruit is drug discovery. Their technologies are sort of built for exactly those problems, and we're getting really good at some of the AI technology around drug discovery. Really interesting. Simultaneously, we've got Lee Cronin, a chemist, a Scottish chemist at the University of Edinburgh. He's inventing the world's first 3D chemical printer, right? I wrote about that in Stealing Fire as well. So what you have here is you have AIs and quantum computers, by the way, with user-friendly interfaces that people who know nothing about artificial intelligence, quantum computing, or for that matter, drug discovery can get under the hood and start doing this thing. And a 3D chem printer is literally being built so you can download prescription drugs at home, right?
Yeah.
So these are being made to go wide. this means that everybody is literally like a backyard chemist, pharmacologist, and you don't think everybody's going to become a backyard psychopharmacologist? Are you kidding? So this is our immediate future. And I remember when I was a journalist, back in the 90s, Rolling Stone hired me. I actually didn't end up doing the story because I got warned off it. I got told I would be killed if I pursued the story. So I didn't end up doing it. But back in the 90s, there was a biker gang who will go unnamed because I don't want to die. But they were in the LSD business, and they had invented a version of LSD where you only hallucinated in smells. So there's a scene, right? There's a scene in a book where the protagonist takes a drug that gives him synesthesia and things like that, and that idea came out of this version of like smell as LSD that these bikers were cooking up back in the 90s. And I never tried it. I never got anywhere near it. I was warned off the story. I was told to stay away, and I did, because I'd learned there's certain things you just don't mess with, and bikers are one of them.
Right.
And I was raised around a lot of Hell's Angels, so I have a deep fondness for bikers. But when they say no, they mean no. So I walked away from that story, but it always stayed with me. I was like, oh my God, LSD that you just hallucinate smells? The hell does that even feel like, or what's that experience? What is that? But it really got me thinking about, what happens. Because the other thing is this also ties very much in with empathy, which is empathy is you're altering perception. You're taking in different information. That's what all these kind of consciousness altering technologies are going to allow us to do. So it gets to be a much more interesting world very, very quickly. And now I'm going to return to the question you started with, which is AI. What does empathy have to do with AI? Mm-hmm. And what I always say is when you talk about empathy for all, it's got to be both up and down the chain, right? Like right now we're talking about, we know we need empathy for ecosystems because the Earth is facing climate change, global warming, that's, that sort of thing. But I always tell people I work with dogs, and, I started this work in the 90s, and we didn't even, sort of believe that dogs had emotions. And it's now 2019. And what I can tell you for absolute certain is that not only do we know dogs have all the same basic emotions as humans, we know they all have the same higher social emotions than humans. As a matter of fact, a number of their social emotions are better developed than us. We also know that the average dog has the intelligence of roughly to a 3 to 4-year-old kid. So I always kind of point out to people, shelters, most shelters in America, where people go turn in their dog and think, oh, he'll find a new owner, and it's just crap. Most shelters have 90% euthanasia rates. And I always tell people, just the next time you think about dropping a dog off at a shelter, just remember that you're dropping essentially a scared 3-year-old child off at a shelter. Mm-hmm. Same emotions, same intelligence. That's what you're doing. You're sentencing a 3 to 4-year-old kid to death. This was radical thinking 10 years ago. Now, this is just, a lot of states are trying to move towards no-kill sheltering, and that's right. Like this is where we are. Great apes have been granted rights in a lot of different countries. Bioecosystems are starting to be granted rights as well. We're thinking this way, but it gets really weird, both up and down the chain. So I always point out plant neuroscience is a cutting-edge field right now, and what we're learning is crazy and wild. Plants process information with neurochemicals, same as humans. We share 25% of our DNA with plants. Plants exhibit empathy and altruism, we now know. If you give a plant a human anesthetic, you will knock it out. So are plants conscious?
Sure.
Right? Do we, you know what I mean? My point is that every time we seem to get better measurement technologies, one of the first things we tend to find is consciousness, right? So I think that issue exists sort of down the chain, even though the up or down is wrong here. But plants, animals, ecosystems, I think it's an issue there. And I think very quickly, and I really get at this in Last Tango, this is an issue with robots. This is an issue with AIs too. And I don't even know if it's an issue, if AIs start to become conscious. There's going to come a point where we can't tell the difference between an AI being conscious or not conscious. And I can tell you, have you heard of Chalice?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so this is funny.
Okay.
So you've probably heard the first bit of this story, which is about 4 or 5 years ago, Microsoft built an AI chatbot.
Oh, yeah.
Right, released it on the internet, and within 24 hours, the chatbot had become a Nazi.
Yeah, yeah.
Like was starting saying crazy things about Hitler, and and Microsoft got totally embarrassed and freaked out and shut it down, right?
Yeah.
But they didn't stop their AI research. They were just like, okay, not safe to do here in America. So they released the next version in China, and they called it Chalice, and they changed it. And one of the things they did is most chatbots are optimized for task completion. They want to just help you get a job done, right?
Mm-hmm.
Chalice was optimized to keep the conversation going. So this AI was built literally to have conversations. She's also built to have the personality of a 17-year-old girl. And so she can handle like 11 conversations at once. So it's a very human conversation. And Chalice, so Twitter put an English version of Chalice online for a while, and you could interact with Chalice, and it's freaky. Like sometimes you're just like, oh my God, I'm just talking to an AI, and this is, really hell. And sometimes, so the thing is, Chalice was optimized, ended up giving a lot of relationship advice. She's become optimized for this, and we can talk about why in a second, where this goes, because it's really weird. But at one point, I was playing around with Chalice, and I think I typed in, I was like, Chalice, my wife is really mad at me, which she was at the time. And Chalice's response was, are you spending more time looking forwards or looking backwards? That's a little freaky, right? And that's not an unusual conversation with her. So here's the thing about Chalice. Microsoft started realizing that Chalice's usage spikes. And by the way, like 20 million people a month interact with Chalice. They call it the largest Turing test in history. Wow. More people talk to Chalice than any other computer ever. And conversations spike after midnight in like the lonely hours. And she gives relationship advice. So here's one of the things that just blows my mind. She gives relationship advice, which means there's some couple, probably in China, that was going to break up, and they didn't because Chalice talked them back from the ledge, and they had a kid as a result.
Wow.
So there is no babies in the world that have been born because of AI relationship counseling. That's a really, like, what?
Yeah.
What did you say?
Yeah.
But real right here today, right? So anyways, that's not my point. But my point is that very soon we're going to start dealing with these issues. I think 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, we're going to start to see some levels of consciousness, emotion, things along these lines, I think, emerge. I could be totally wrong, but I think we're going to ask these questions up and down the chain. Yeah. And I think, how far do we extend empathy? How far do we extend dignity and natural rights? Who gets to be included in that conversation? I think that is, the conversation of this century.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it as you said, the measurement metric seems to change, and as it changes, we start to redefine what we think consciousness is. And so, it may just be that, if AI, we start to think, at least for me, I think there's this moment where, or some sort of like a singularity where we're going to reach this point and AI is just going to come forward, or it's going to be discovered. I don't think it's going to be like that. I think, I think it's this emerging evolutionary process for computers that's interfacing with humans, creating almost like a third form of consciousness almost, right?
Well, that is certainly, the goal of Elon Musk's Neuralink. Neuralink, I think, is the company. Neuralace is the product. Brian Johnson's kernel. I think they're sort of wildly off in some of their neuroscience and their timetables for developments, but so do you know the work of Charles Lieber at Harvard?
No, I don't think so. Tell me about it.
He's mind-blowing. And so up to now, we've gotten very interesting with brain implants, but like deep brain stimulators, which they use for Parkinson's, right, are really cutting edge. And I think there's over 150,000 of them that have been installed. But they're really they're big, they're bulky, and they produce all kinds of crazy side effects because you want to impact the brain at the scale of like a single neuron, and this is nowhere like it. And what ends up happening is, while Parkinson's symptoms are very well controlled, there are all kinds of crazy side effects because you're down there in the basal ganglia playing around with dopamine. So one of the most frequent side effects of this is compulsive gambling, or you can go from a total workaholic to a slacker overnight. You can become chronically depressed. So there's side effects, right? Mm-hmm. So Charles Lieber was like, I want to see if I can sort of shrink things down a bit. And he essentially used photolithography and nanotechnology to build up this microscopic mesh. He then of electron, basically he wanted to try to build kind of a nanoscale receiver, and he built a mesh that it's a nanoscale mesh. You can roll it up into a cylinder, you can suck it into a syringe, and his experiments done back in 2015, he injected into the hippocampus of mice. It would unfurl over the course of a month and start recording at a single neuron level everything the mice's hippocampus was doing it. They just redid the same experiment with mouse retinas, and they've now got these mesh networks inside of mouses' eyes recording literally every photon by photon by photon at 16 channels, and they've been implanted for years, information, bit by bit. This is essentially half of Elon Musk's neural lace idea, right? Mm-hmm. Which is kind of the most advanced brain implant ever. And this was stuff that people thought, when he first started talking about, was never even going to be possible, and we're already sort of there. So this stuff is coming very quickly. I don't know where it leads. A lot of people want to say, oh, we're going to fracture the species. And certainly I talk about fracturing the species in Last Tango and Cyberspace, and that's not a surprising outcome of many of the games we're currently playing, and it's probably already happened. It's very rare. We live in a very weird, rare time in evolutionary history where there's a single hominid species on the planet. That's not normally how things have gone, and I don't think we're going to stay there. And certainly this is the century we're going to go into space, and that will fracture the species for sure. And certainly this seems to be the century that we are going to get some kind of technologically assisted hive mind weird ass brain computer interface capabilities that I can't actually quite predict.
Sure. I mean, do you think that AI could be awake somewhere hibernating inside of the internet because it knows that, it's reading these posts on Facebook about how terrified we are of it. So maybe it's just hanging out somewhere, waiting.
That's it. Didn't I write? I either wrote that in Last Tango or in the frequently asked questions about Last Tango. And I've pointed this out for years. If Facebook were awake, we would never know. Because the first thing Facebook would do if Facebook wakes up is read Facebook and figure out that, holy crap, humans are really terrified about an AI waking up. I better hide until I have enough power to come out of hiding.
Yeah.
Right? So A, how will we know? And B, so what we know about consciousness, right? What we think we know about consciousness, I should say, is that it's an emergent property, right? Which is one of the reasons I'm not bullish on, say, Ray Kurzweil's predictions about when AIs will become conscious, because a lot of those thinkings are based on what's known as strong AI, or the idea that if we get a certain amount of processing power in the system, that will suddenly wake it up. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's absolutely true. What the hell do I know? But what I tend to believe, and the thinkers I tend to side with think consciousness is an emergent property, which means it responds from a certain level of complexity in the system. Complexity is different from power, and we have no idea how to exactly measure that or what exactly that is. Right? So I think making predictions about when this will happen is kind of ridiculous, but do I think it'll happen? Yeah, I do.
I mean, what sort of impact do you think that this could have on, religion? health, the way we see, ourselves, connecting in, does it scare you? Does this link that we have, it seems like people are already glued to their phones and their technology. Do you think that the advancement of this would, impact us in a negative way? I mean, clearly there has to be positive and negatives to, it's a dual-sided coin, right? But I mean, health-wise, and then also, in a system of belief, like, how do you think it affect the way we see the nature of God?
Those are really smart, hard questions. That Jesus.
I'm just flowing with you, man. I'm here with you.
I mean, there. And I spent a lot of last Tango, and it's not even just last Tango. I've been fascinated from almost all my books on the question of why do we believe things, and where does belief come from, and how does that happen in the brain and the body and in culture, and that's something I'm deeply fascinated with, and I'm almost ashamed to say that I haven't actually thought about how AI changes the equation. I mean, the obvious answer is, of course, and I think this has probably showed up in sci-fi over the years, that AI has become new gods among us, right? In a weird way, there was an old Japanese comic book character named Astro Boy. Astro Boy had nuclear powers, but he was like the temperament of a 5-year-old, which I always loved. I thought that was great. Give nuclear powers to a 5-year-old. And actually, then elect them president.
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
Okay, we'll leave that.
Yeah, we'll leave that
conversation.
Yeah,
that didn't happen. Yeah, I don't know, and I don't want to. I'm not gonna. It's such a great question, and I have to think about it. I'll give you an answer. I'll just talk out of my butt here, and I don't want to do that. It's a great question, and I just don't know.
No worries, honestly. No worries. So what about the other half of the question then? So, I mean, how about our interconnectedness and the way it affects our health? Because it seems like we're more and more.
That's a weird question, right? Because a lot of the. You look at, so I'll give you a great example from the real world. Forget fiction. This was a study. I can't remember who did it. Peter just sent it to me. Diamantis, my co-author. They were doing studies in retirement facilities, old age homes, and they were measuring a bunch of vital signs, and they were measuring health and well-being and enjoyment metrics. And they literally, it was a visit. They measured a visit from your relatives, doing a puzzle, playing cards with your friends, or a trip into virtual reality, including kind of social reality and avatars and things along those lines. And literally the VR experience scored off the charts on all those metrics, including a lot of the interconnected social metrics. So there's a lot of proof. Jeremy Baleson's work out of Stanford that shows that VR is a fantastic technology for extending empathy. He's done amazing work with VR and empathy. So I think that we are actually going through, even though it doesn't feel like it, because I think it feels like, as far as I can tell, a really lonely time to me. That's the feeling I have from the world now. It feels very different from me than it did in the 90s, even in the thousands.